Hello, everyone. Everyone wants to know something about the British Empire because the British left a huge mark on history. This is part one of our video about the British Empire. Let's take a look. After Caesar's expeditions, the Romans began a serious and sustained attempt to conquer Britain in AD 43 at the behest of Emperor Claudius. They landed in Kent with 4 legions and defeated 2 armies led by the kings of the Catuvellauni tribe, Caradocus and Togodumnus, in battles at the Medway and the Thames. Togodumnus was killed and Caradocus fled to Wales. The Roman force, led by Aulus Plautius, waited for Claudius to come and lead the final march on the Catuvellauni capital at Caemulodunum, modern Colchester, before he returned to Rome for his triumph. The Catuvellauni held sway over most of the southeastern corner of England. 11 local rulers surrendered, a number of client kingdoms were established, and the rest became a Roman province with Caemulodunum as its capital. Over the next 4 years, the territory was consolidated, and the future Emperor Vespasian led a campaign into the southwest where he subjugated 2 more tribes. By AD 54, the border had been pushed back to the Severn and the Trent, and campaigns were underway to subjugate northern England and Wales. But in AD 60, under the leadership of the warrior queen Boudica, the tribes rebelled against the Romans. At first, the rebels had great success. They burned Caemulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, modern-day Colchester, London, and St. Albans respectively, to the ground. There is some archaeological evidence that the same happened at Winchester. The 2nd Legion Augusta, stationed at Exeter, refused to move for fear of revolt among the locals. Londinium governor Suetonius Paulinus evacuated the city before the rebels sacked and burned it. The fire was so hot that a 10-inch layer of melted red clay remains 15 feet below London streets. In the end, the rebels were said to have killed 70,000 Romans and Roman sympathizers. Paulinus gathered what was left of the Roman army. In the decisive battle, 10,000 Romans faced nearly 100,000 warriors somewhere along the line of Watling Street, at the end of which Boudica was utterly defeated. It was said that 80,000 rebels were killed, but only 400 Romans. Over the next 20 years, the borders expanded slightly, but the governor Agricola incorporated into the province the last pockets of independence in Wales and northern England. He also led a campaign into Scotland, which was recalled by Emperor Domitian. The border gradually formed along the Stanegate Road in northern England, solidified by Hadrian's Wall built in AD 138, despite temporary forays into Scotland. The Romans and their culture stayed in charge for 350 years. Traces of their presence are ubiquitous throughout England. In the wake of the breakdown of Roman rule in Britain from the middle of the 4th century, present-day England was progressively settled by Germanic groups. Collectively known as the Anglo-Saxons, these included Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. The Battle of Diorham was critical in establishing Anglo-Saxon rule in 500–77. Saxon mercenaries existed in Britain since before the late Roman period, but the main influx of population probably happened after the 5th century. The precise nature of these invasions is not fully known. There are doubts about the legitimacy of historical accounts due to a lack of archaeological finds. Gildas's De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, composed in the 6th century, states that when the Roman army departed the Isle of Britannia in the 4th century AD, the indigenous Britons were invaded by Picts, their neighbors to the north, now Scotland, and the Scots, now Ireland. Britons invited the Saxons to the island to repel them, but after they vanquished the Scots and Picts, the Saxons turned against the Britons. 7 kingdoms are traditionally identified as being established by these migrants. 3 were clustered in the southeast: Sussex, Kent, and Essex. The Midlands were dominated by the kingdoms of Mercia and East Anglia. To the north was Northumbria, which unified 2 earlier kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. Other smaller kingdoms seem to have existed as well, such as Lindsey in what is now Lincolnshire, and the Hwicce in the southwest. Eventually, the kingdoms were dominated by Northumbria and Mercia in the 7th century, Mercia in the 8th century, and then Wessex in the 9th century. Northumbria eventually extended its control north into Scotland and west into Wales. It also subdued Mercia, whose first powerful king, Penda, was killed by Oswy in 655. Northumbria's power began to wane after 685 with the defeat and death of its king Egfrith at the hands of the Picts. Mercian power reached its peak under the rule of Offa, who from 785 had influence over most of Anglo-Saxon England. Since Offa's death in 796, the supremacy of Wessex was established under Egbert, who extended control west into Cornwall. Before defeating the Mercians at the Battle of Ellendon in 825. 4 years later, he received submission and tribute from the Northumbrian king, Eanred. Since so few contemporary sources exist, the events of the 5th and 6th centuries are difficult to ascertain. As such, the nature of the Anglo-Saxon settlements is debated by historians, archaeologists, and linguists. The traditional view that the Anglo-Saxons drove the Romano-British inhabitants out of what is now England was subject to reappraisal in the later 20th century. One suggestion is that the invaders were smaller in number, drawn from an elite class of male warriors that gradually acculturated the natives. An emerging view is that the scale of the Anglo-Saxon settlement varied across England, and that as such it cannot be described by any one process in particular. Mass migration and population shift seem to be most applicable in the core areas of settlement, such as East Anglia and Lincolnshire, while in more peripheral areas to the northwest, much of the native population likely remained in place as the incomers took over as elites. In a study of place names in northeastern England and southern Scotland, Bethany Fox concluded that Anglian migrants settled in large numbers in river valleys, such as those of the Tyne and the Tweed, with the Britons in the less fertile hill country becoming acculturated over a longer period. Fox interprets the process by which English came to dominate this region as a synthesis of mass migration and elite takeover models. Genetic testing has been used to find evidence of large-scale immigration of Germanic peoples into England. Wheel et al. 2002 found that English Y-DNA data showed signs of a mass Anglo-Saxon immigration from the European continent, affecting 50% to 100% of the male gene pool in central England. This was based on the similarity of the DNA collected from small English towns to that found in Friesland. A 2003 study with samples coming from larger towns found a large variance in amounts of continental Germanic ancestry in different parts of England. In the study, such markers typically ranged from 20% and 45% in southern England, with East Anglia, the East Midlands, and Yorkshire having over 50% North German and Danish genetic frequencies were indistinguishable, thus precluding any ability to distinguish between the genetic influence of the Anglo-Saxon source populations and the later and better documented influx of Danish Vikings. The mean value of continental Germanic genetic input in this study was calculated at 54%. In response to arguments such as those of Stephen Oppenheimer and Brian Sykes, that the similarity between English and continental Germanic DNA could have originated from earlier prehistoric migrations, researchers have begun to use data collected from ancient burials to ascertain the level of Anglo-Saxon contribution to the modern English gene pool. 2 studies published in 2016 based on data collected from skeletons found in Iron Age, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon era graves in Cambridgeshire and Yorkshire concluded that the ancestry of the modern English population contains large contributions from both Anglo-Saxon migrants and Romano-British natives. Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England began around 600 AD, influenced by Celtic Christianity from the northwest and the Roman Catholic Church from the southeast. Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, took office in 597. In 601, he baptized the first Christian Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelbert of Kent. The last pagan Anglo-Saxon king, Penda of Mercia, died in 655. The last pagan Judish king, Arwald of the Isle of Wight, was killed in 686. The Anglo-Saxon mission on the continent took off in the 8th century, leading to the Christianization of practically all of the Frankish Empire by 800. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, power fluctuated between the larger kingdoms. Beda records Ethelbert of Kent as being dominant at the close of the 6th century, but power seems to have shifted northwards to the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was formed from the amalgamation of Bernicia, and Dira Edwin of Northumbria probably held dominance over much of Britain, though Bede's Northumbrian bias should be kept in mind. Due to succession crises, Northumbrian hegemony was not constant, and Mercia remained a very powerful kingdom, especially under Penda. 2 defeats ended Northumbrian dominance: the Battle of the Trent in 679 against Mercia, and Nectanesmir in 685 against the Picts. The so-called Mercian supremacy dominated the 8th century, though it was not constant. Ethelbald and Offa, the 2 most powerful kings, achieved high status. Indeed, Offa was considered the overlord of South Britain by Charlemagne. His power is illustrated by the fact that he summoned the resources to build Offa's Dyke. However, a rising Wessex and challenges from smaller kingdoms kept Mercian power in check, and by the early 9th century, the Mercian supremacy was over. This period has been described as the Heptarchy, though this term has now fallen out of academic use. The term arose because the 7 kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, Kent, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex were the main polities of South Britain. Other small kingdoms were also politically important across this period: Huesca, Magansite, Lindsey, and Middle Anglia. The first recorded landing of Vikings took place in 787 in Dorsetshire, on the southwest coast. The first major attack in Britain was in 793 at Lindisfarne Monastery, as given by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. However, by then the Vikings were almost certainly well established in Orkney and Shetland, and many other non-recorded raids probably occurred before this. Records do show the first Viking attack on Iona taking place in 794. The arrival of the Vikings, in particular the Danish Great Heathen Army, upset the political and social geography of Britain and Ireland. In 867, Northumbria fell to the Danes. East Anglia fell in 869. Though Wessex managed to contain the Vikings by defeating them at Ashdown in 871, a second invading army landed, leaving the Saxons on a defensive footing. At much the same time, Ethelred, king of Wessex, died and was succeeded by his younger brother Alfred. Alfred was immediately confronted with the task of defending Wessex against the Danes. He spent the first 5 years of his reign paying the invaders off. In 878, Alfred's forces were overwhelmed at Chippenham in a surprise attack. It was only now, with the independence of Wessex hanging by a thread, that Alfred emerged as a great king. In May 878, he led a force that defeated the Danes at Edington. The victory was so complete that the Danish leader Guthrum was forced to accept Christian baptism and withdraw from Mercia. Alfred then set about strengthening the defenses of Wessex, building a new navy, 60 vessels strong. Alfred's success bought Wessex and Mercia years of peace and sparked economic recovery in previously ravaged areas. Alfred's success was sustained by his son Edward, whose decisive victories over the Danes in East Anglia in 910 and 911 were followed by a crushing victory at Tempsford in 917. These military gains allowed Edward to fully incorporate Mercia into his kingdom and add East Anglia to his conquests. Edward then set about reinforcing his northern borders against the Danish kingdom of Northumbria. Edward's rapid conquest of the English kingdoms meant Wessex received homage from those that remained, including Gwynedd in Wales and Scotland. His dominance was reinforced by his son Ethelstan, who extended the borders of Wessex northward, in 927 conquering the Kingdom of York and leading a land and naval invasion of Scotland. These conquests led to his adopting the title King of the English For the first time, the dominance and independence of England was maintained by the kings that followed. It was not until 978 and the accession of Ethelred the Unready that the Danish threat resurfaced. Two powerful Danish kings, Harold Bluetooth and later his son Swine, both launched devastating invasions of England. Anglo-Saxon forces were resoundingly defeated at Malden in 991. More Danish attacks followed, and their victories were frequent. Ethelred's control over his nobles began to falter, and he grew increasingly desperate. His solution was to pay off the Danes. For almost 20 years, he paid increasingly large sums to the Danish nobles to keep them from English coasts. These payments, known as Danegelds, crippled the English economy. Ethelred then made an alliance with Normandy in 1001 through marriage to the Duke's daughter Emma, in the hope of strengthening England. Then he made a great error. In 1002, he ordered the massacre of all the Danes in England. In response, Swine began a decade of devastating attacks on northern England, with its sizable Danish population sided with Swine. By 1013, London, Oxford, and Winchester had fallen to the Danes. Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Swine seized the throne. Swine suddenly died in 1014, and Ethelred returned to England, confronted by Swine's successor, Cnut. However, in 1016, Ethelred also suddenly died. Cnut swiftly defeated the remaining Saxons, killing Ethelred's son Edmund in the process. Cnut seized the throne, crowning himself King of England. Alfred of Wessex died in 899 and was succeeded by his son Edward the Elder. Edward and his brother-in-law Ethelred, of what was left of Mercia, began a program of expansion, building forts and towns on an Alfredian model. On Ethelred's death, his wife, Edward's sister, Ethelfled, ruled as Lady of the Mercians and continued expansion. It seems Edward had his son Aethelstan brought up in the Mercian court. On Edward's death, Aethelstan succeeded to the Mercian kingdom, and after some uncertainty, Wessex. Aethelstan continued the expansion of his father and aunt, and was the first king to achieve direct rulership of what we would now consider England. The titles attributed to him in charters and on coins suggest a still more widespread dominance. His expansion aroused ill feeling among the other kingdoms of Britain, and he defeated a combined Scottish Viking army at the Battle of Brunanburh. However, the unification of England was not a certainty. Under Ethelstan's successors, Edmund and Adred, the English kings, repeatedly lost and regained control of Northumbria. Nevertheless, Edgar, who ruled the same expanse as Ethelstan, consolidated the kingdom, which remained united thereafter. England, under the Danes and the Norman conquest, there were renewed Scandinavian attacks on England at the end of the 10th century. Ethelred ruled a long reign, but ultimately lost his kingdom to Swine of Denmark, though he recovered it following the latter's death. However, Ethelred's son, Edmund II Ironside, died shortly afterwards, allowing Nut, Swine's son, to become King of England. Under his rule, the kingdom became the center of government for the North Sea Empire, which included Denmark and Norway. Cnut was succeeded by his sons, but in 1042 the native dynasty was restored with the accession of Edward the Confessor. Edward's failure to produce an heir caused a furious conflict over the succession on his death in 1066. His struggles for power against Godwin, Earl of Wessex, the claims of Cnut's Scandinavian successors, and the ambitions of the Normans whom Edward introduced to English politics to bolster his own position, caused each to vie for control of Edward's reign. Harold Godwinson became king, probably appointed by Edward on his deathbed and endorsed by the Witan. But William of Normandy, Harold Hardroad, aided by Harold Godwin's estranged brother Tostig, and Sweyn II of Denmark, all asserted claims to the throne, By far the strongest hereditary claim was that of Edgar the Etheling, but due to his youth and apparent lack of powerful supporters, he did not play a major part in the struggles of 1066, although he was made king for a short time by the Witan after the death of Harold Godwinson. In September 1066, Harold III of Norway and Earl Tostig landed in northern England with a force of around 15,000 men and 300 longships. Harold Godwinson defeated the invaders and killed Harold III of Norway, and Tostig at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. On 28 September 1066, William of Normandy invaded England in a campaign called the Norman Conquest. After marching from Yorkshire, Harold's exhausted army was defeated, and Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings on 14 October. Further opposition to William in support of Edgar, the Etheling, soon collapsed, and William was crowned king on Christmas Day 1066. For 5 years he faced a series of rebellions in various parts of England, and a half-hearted Danish invasion, but he subdued them and established an enduring regime. The Norman conquest led to a profound change in the history of the English state. William ordered the compilation of the Domesday Book, a survey of the entire population and their lands and property for tax purposes, which reveals that within 20 years of the conquest, the English ruling class had been almost entirely dispossessed and replaced by Norman landholders, who monopolized all senior positions in the government and the church. William and his nobles spoke and conducted court in Norman French in both Normandy and England. The use of the Anglo-Norman language by the aristocracy endured for centuries and left an indelible mark in the development of modern English upon being crowned. On Christmas Day 1066, William immediately began consolidating his power. By 1067, he faced revolts on all sides and spent 4 years crushing them. He then imposed his superiority over Scotland and Wales, forcing them to recognize him as overlord. Economic growth and state finances were aided by the beginning of Jewish settlement in London. The English Middle Ages were characterized by civil war, international war, occasional insurrection, and widespread political intrigue among the aristocratic and monarchic elite. England was more than self-sufficient in cereals, dairy products, beef, and mutton. Its international economy was based on wool trade, in which wool from the sheepwalks of northern England was exported to the textile cities of Flanders, where it was worked into cloth. Medieval foreign policy was as much shaped by relations with the Flemish textile industry as it was by dynastic adventures in western France. An English textile industry was established in the 15th century, providing the basis for rapid English capital accumulation. Henry I, the fourth son of William I the Conqueror, succeeded his elder brother William II as King of England in 1100. Henry was also known as Henry Beauclerc because he received a formal education, unlike his older brother and heir apparent William, who got practical training to be King Henry, worked hard to reform and stabilize the country, and smooth the differences between the Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman societies. The loss of his son, William Adelin, in the wreck of the White Ship in November 1120, undermined his reforms. This problem regarding succession cast a long shadow over English history. Henry I had required the leading barons, ecclesiastics, and officials in Normandy and England to take an oath to accept Matilda, also known as Empress Maud, Henry I's daughter, as his heir. England was far less than enthusiastic to accept an outsider and a woman as their ruler. There is some evidence that Henry was unsure of his own hopes and the oath to make Matilda his heir. Probably Henry hoped Matilda would have a son and step aside as queen mother. Upon Henry's death, the Norman and English barons ignored Matilda's claim to the throne, and thus through a series of decisions, Stephen, Henry's favorite nephew, was welcomed by many in England and Normandy as their new king. On 22 December 1135, Stephen was anointed king with implicit support by the church and nation. Matilda and her own son waited in France until she sparked the civil war from 1139 to 1153, known as the Anarchy. In the autumn of 1139, she invaded England with her illegitimate half-brother Robert of Gloucester. Her husband, Geoffroy V of Anjou, conquered Normandy but did not cross the Channel to help his wife. During this breakdown of central authority, nobles built adulterine castles, i.e. castles erected without government permission, which were hated by the peasants who were forced to build and maintain them. Stephen was captured and his government fell. Matilda was proclaimed queen but was soon at odds with her subjects and was expelled from London. The war continued until 1148 when Matilda returned to France. Stephen reigned unopposed until his death in 1154, although his hold on the throne was uneasy. As soon as he regained power, he began to demolish the adulterine castles, but kept a few castles standing, which put him at odds with his heir. His contested reign, civil war, and lawlessness saw a major swing in power towards feudal barons. In trying to appease Scottish and Welsh raiders, he handed over large tracts of land.